Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight at the Beacon Historical Society. I'm Diane Lapis, President, and this is Emily Murnane, our trustee, who's going to be giving the presentation this evening. Before we begin, we always like to say the pledge, so if you would be so kind to rise, and again, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So before we begin, I have a few announcements to make. We have another busy June. On June 6th, which is a Monday, we're going to be unveiling a marker at Red Flynn Drive, which is right down by the river, regarding Lafayette's visit to, which was Fishkill Landing, now Beacon, during his 1824-1825 U.S. tour. So if you're available at 2 o'clock, please join us at the riverfront for the unveiling of the marker. And then at 7 o'clock that evening at the Beacon High School Theater, we will be doing a program with Julien Miché, who's a Frenchman who created the Lafayette Trail, where he's placing markers throughout the country wherever Lafayette stopped on his tour, which of course seminally here in Beacon. And I understand from Mary Tammany, the Newburgh historian, also Lafayette visited Newburgh, and she has important documents at the Newburgh Historical Society regarding that visit. So thank you for sharing that. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know. It's also on our website. On June 11th, right here in this building, we will be doing our 4th annual postcard, book, and ephemera show. So I hope you join us. We'll have 12 to 15 dealers who are bringing postcards, books, and ephemera for sale. It is a fundraiser for us. We will be serving food. There'll be door prizes and raffles as well. So if you're a postcard collector, book collector, come on down and join in the fun. And then on June 28th, David Rocco, who's the author of Indestructible Man, about the airplane crash on Mount Beacon in 1948. He will be here to talk about that story, about the 6 naval servicemen who died, including Dixie Kiefer, who was a famed World War II hero. So please join us for that event, again at 7 o'clock, like we always do for our lecture series. And then if you haven't seen our new exhibition at the Beacon Historical Society on majestic Mount Beacon and the Incline Railway, please come see it. It's really quite spectacular. So, and I see a lot of people who were here at our opening event, so I want to thank you for joining us as we dedicated our building to Robert G. Murphy and celebrating being together and just enjoying history, Beacon's history. So thank you. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Emily, and she's going to explain how the evening is going to work tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Hello, everybody. Good to see lots of familiar faces here. I'm Emily Murnane. I am currently the Secretary of the Beacon Historical Society, and I am also a friend of the Reformed Church of Beacon, and I've been working on digitizing their archival records for about 2 years now, which is our first large-scale digital archival project. The presentation you're about to see is actually a presentation I delivered last April, back in April of 2021, that we recorded and are going to be rerunning due to popular demand, and we'll follow that up with a live Q&A with me about the current state of the project and the questions you may have about the history of the Reformed Church. And then later in the night, we'll also be joined by Gavin Heckert, who is the current owner of the property. He'll take any questions you may have about the current state of the property and his plans for the church. So without further ado, I guess we'll get started. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily.
Hello neighbors, and thank you so much for joining us for this presentation on the Beacon Historical Society's first large-scale digital archival project, the preservation of the artifacts and documents of the Reformed Church of Beacon. I'm Emily Murnane, trustee of the Beacon Historical Society and friend of the Reformed Church. It's an honor and a joy to be here to present the story of our city's oldest church to you, told through the images and documents found in the church's 207 years of archival records. The Beacon Historical Society has been working tirelessly since May of 2020 to preserve these materials for future generations. In our audience tonight are former members of the church and representatives from the church's governing body, Classis, without whose support this project would not have been possible. Their dedication, their faith, and their love for their church is what inspired me to take up this project, and it's in that spirit that I invite you to travel with me through their memories in a celebration of their role in our history, as well as the legacy they're helping us build for the historians of the future. The story begins in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries during the Protestant Reformation. The Reformed Protestant Dutch Church was carried to the New World by the Dutch immigrants who established their first church in New Amsterdam in 1628. Those same Dutch immigrants and their descendants would later travel up the river to the Hudson Valley. Many of our city's founding families practiced Reformed Protestantism to some degree, the most notable being the family of Madame Katharina Brett, widely recognized as the founder of our community. It was Madame Brett who donated the land to build the Reformed Church of Fishkill in about 1725. She also later built the road now known as Route 52, which is affectionately called Madame Brett's Road around these parts. And she built that road in order to travel to Fishkill and therefore her church with a lot more ease. But even with the road traveling from the twin villages of Madawan and Fishkill Landing, these being the two settlements that would later become the city of Beacon, traveling to the next village for church was difficult or outright impossible for some. The road would need to be traveled by foot or by carriage, and that could take the better part of the day, which meant that if you lived in the twin villages, the Lord's Day of Rest usually didn't involve a whole lot of rest. But luckily, the villages were growing, and soon it was time for them to build their own church. And that idea was proposed by John Peter de Wint of Fishkill Landing. De Wint was a wealthy shipping magnate and philanthropist, as well as the husband of President John Adams' favorite granddaughter. He was also the landowner of most of the plots in Fishkill Landing. He would later go on to build Long Wharf, which is present-day Long Dock Park, which would allow him to control much of the waterfront commerce, and he accrued a net worth of about $2 million by his death in 1870. And that's in 1870 money, not in 2021. So de Wint's chapter of the story does take place in 1813, prior to when he made his fortune, when he organized the building of the very first church in the Twin Villages. Simple style that was preferred by the Reformed Protestants of the era. Pictures of the interior of this church haven't survived, but we do have a description that was published in the church's Centennial booklet by a Mrs. Samuel Verplank. And she recalls the pews where she used to sit with her family, shown in the excerpt here. A lot of her recollections offer a humorous or sentimental glimpse into what it was like to grow up in that early Reformed Church of Beacon, then called the Reformed Church of Fishkill Landing, of course. She recalls one incident in the late 1850s where a large gentleman blocked her view of the pulpit, and it wasn't until after the service that she learned this stranger was actually former President Millard Fillmore, who happened to be in town visiting his friend Judge Davies that day. She recounts another anecdote describing the time that her brother caught a mouse in the old church, and when he saw how thin it was, he put it in a box and sent it to the parsonage with a note reading, "Did you ever hear of being poor as a church mouse? Well, here's a specimen from the Reformed Dutch Church." And the pastor on the receiving end of that joke was the good-natured and well-loved Dr. Howard Soydam, who led the Reformed Church from 1857 to 1862. His tenure was short, but this was actually one of the church's most eventful eras. For example, in 1859, it was decided that the old church building was too small for the growing congregation, and it was in ill repair, so they decided to demolish it and rebuild. The process would require the worshipers to hold their service in the neighboring Presbyterian Church of Madawan for a period of 2 years, and the price of building the new church was $15,000. They were aided in this endeavor by the de Wint family, who would once again play a crucial role in the building of the church, this time in designing the building itself. 2 of John de Wint's daughters had actually married architects. His daughter Caroline married Andrew Jackson Downing, father of American landscape design and a Newburgh native. Her sister Emily married his business partner, who was an up-and-coming British architect named Frederick Withers, who would later become known for his churches, many of which are now nationally registered historic sites. In 1859, Withers was already busy building the estate of Joseph and Eliza Halland, which would be named Tyranda and would later become Craig House Hospital. His connection to the de Wints and the fact that he was working locally were likely the reasons why he was chosen to design the new Reformed Church. Withers is usually considered one of the major influences that brought high Gothic architecture into fashion in America. And many of his churches, including this later work of his, which is St. Luke's Church of Matawan, 1870, those resembled the rural village churches of his English upbringing, but his plans for the Reformed Church in Fishkill Landing more closely resembled the vision that he was executing with Tioronda. And that featured patterned brickwork in multiple colors, an ornate belfry, a slate roof, and lancet windows. Now, one difficulty that Withers met in executing this design was he was not able to find a resource of black bricks, so he had to only use red and yellow for the church. This patterned brickwork was actually considered very controversial for the time, and some of the more conservative members of the church were very skeptical of Withers' kind of avant-garde design. So maybe it was kind of a saving grace that he wasn't able to use 3 colors of bricks, because they were already skeptical of 2. The church of today that we're so familiar with does differ from Withers' original structure, which is featured in a drawing here, but changes were made to the building over the last century, as you can see. No photos exist of that original structure. This drawing is the best we've got. We have an early, undated photo that does show the facade after the changes. You can see that the belfry has been removed. That's because it was deemed unsafe in 1887, and they later dismantled it. And a fun little local historical fact is that stone was actually purchased by a local doctor, Riverview Sanatorium owner, Dr. Charles Kittredge. Unfortunately, I don't know what he actually did with the stone. We just know that he purchased it. So, even with the changes, Withers' signature style is clearly visible on the building as it currently stands. And I think it's especially special because it's a building unlike any other in America. It's a Dutch Reformed Protestant church with Italian Gothic characteristics, and it's patterned with Hudson Valley bricks. So once the church was finished, services returned in late 1860, and they had the official dedication a year later in 1861. Now, the American Civil War broke out the same year, and Dr. Soydam, pictured here, was a vocal and outspoken supporter of the Northern cause. He's quoted by Mrs. Verplanck as saying, "We would like to preserve peace. We would love to have it without bloodshed, if we could, without brother fighting against brother. But when the question comes before us, shall we submit to the promulgation of slavery and the disruption of our government? What shall we say? Send slavery to the bottomless pit and let the government remain forever." Now, that enthusiasm was met with mixed emotions from the congregation. Some admired his energy, but others considered him young and inexperienced, as he was only 2 months in the ministry at the time of taking leadership of the church. Dr. Soydam's own recollections mention that they used to mock him as the boy preacher because he was so young. Those living in the Twin Villages were terrified of the prospect of war, and they were really uncomfortable with his bold statements, and that discomfort increased with the arrival of a visitor, who was a preacher named Henry Ward Beecher. He was the brother of author Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was infamous at the time for her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, and her brother traveled the country preaching abolitionism. Soydam invited this celebrity preacher to give a few sermons at the new church, and when Beecher accepted, the church members panicked. Some warned Soydam that he was actually putting the church in danger, and one Mr. Addington reportedly threatened Soydam with unspecified harm if Beecher was allowed to speak. But speak Beecher did, to a house packed wall to wall. His sense of humor and his kindness won the crowd over, and many of them were in tears by the end of his sermon. And even Mr. Addington returned the following day to the parsonage to inquire if Beecher was going to be invited back to speak again. And he was. Beecher visited the Reformed Church many times afterward, and he was always greeted with enthusiasm after that first visit. So just a few decades later, 1913 marked the centennial of the church's founding. The entire history of the church to that point was recounted in the Centennial book compiled by the aforementioned Mrs. Verplanck and other church elders, including Beacon's Benjamin Hammond, who made a name for himself not only with the pesticides and paints of his Hammond paintworks, but also as a long-serving president of both the local Board of Education and the Mechanics Savings Bank. Now, describing Hammond as Beacon's man is intentional because 1913 was also the year that Matawan and Fishkill Landing incorporated themselves into the city of Beacon, and that new name is proudly displayed on the cover of the church's Centennial book. And for those of you who are keeping score at home, this makes the Reformed Church of Beacon a full century older than the actual city of Beacon, which is bragging rights if I've ever heard of it. So the turn of the century unfortunately brought new hardship to the church as they struggled to find consistent leadership. Records describe a brutal, decades-long hunt for a preacher, and in the meantime, the church often had to rely on supply preachers from the Theological Seminary at New Brunswick. From the 1930s to the late 1950s, the church clerk sent hundreds of letters to prospective pastors, most of whom either politely declined or accepted only as a guest for 1 or 2 Sundays. The unfortunate truth is that the church mice of the Reformed Church just couldn't compete with the salaries that were offered by metropolitan churches. And many of these candidates were reluctant to move to a rural industrial setting like Beacon. Sometimes a preacher would agree to stay. For example, in 1960, the church celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Withers building with the installation of Reverend Gabriel S. Lee. But unfortunately, like many of the church's preachers through the early 20th century, Reverend Lee only stayed a few years before eventually moving on. The world was changing, and the Mid-Hudson region was changing more than most. There was the construction of the Newburgh-Beacon Bridge, and later during urban renewal, Route 9D was paved through the front yard of the church. But the congregation did manage to stay on the positive side of all this change. There's a statement I like from the 150th anniversary brochure in 1963 that captures that tenacious optimism. They said, "No longer will our church be the landmark most prominently seen by the people arriving in Beacon via the ferry. Instead, it will be seen by the greater number of people using the new bridge." The Reformed Church was still the very first church that people could see when they were approaching Beacon side of the river, and that represented a great deal of hope. And the Reformed Church had a symbol of pride as well. That was the grave of a founding father. Colonel William Few was a Georgian representative who had signed the U.S. Constitution and died in 1828 when visiting his daughter's family, the Christies, in Fishkill Landing. His family placed him in what was intended to be the family vault in the Reformed Church's graveyard, but many of the Christies would place their graves elsewhere. And with no formal marker to identify his resting place, Few faded into obscurity until 1938. By then, the grave of every other signee of the Constitution had been located. Colonel Few's presence in the Reformed Church cemetery was not well documented, but church tradition held that he was inside the Christie vault. So ultimately, the vault was opened, and by that point, not much remained except for a tiny silver plaque that bore the name William Few. So together with the Sons of the American Revolution Georgia Society and Beacon's own Daughters of the American Revolution Melzinga chapter, the Reformed Church had a ceremony to mark Colonel Few's grave, and for a brief moment, the church held a place in the national spotlight. But when it was over, the church still had to attend to their more everyday concerns. There were necessary repairs to be made to the Withers building and the parsonage, and families who had belonged to the church for generations were moving away from Beacon and the Hudson Valley, as the region began a slow decline into an economic and industrial downturn that would last for decades. And then in the 1970s, Georgia called again, and this time they wanted their founding father back. Newspapers like the New York Times slandered the Reformed Church and the city of Beacon, painting the region as obscure and neglected. Those journalists and Georgia politicians could not begin to understand what the city of Beacon was going through, and they couldn't begin to understand the pain that their words and their actions would cause for the Reformed Church. Plans were already in the works to restore the cemetery, the Christie Vault included, but it would have been too difficult for a congregation of about 60 to fight the state of Georgia. So the remains of Colonel Few, which were by now only a few bone fragments and teeth, were ceremonially removed to Augusta in the October of 1973. The Few Memorial Stone was moved to the front of the church, where it remains today in a place of honor. Now, the positive side is that this actually caused an unprecedented uptick in the church attendance. By 1975, only 2 years later, the church reported membership of around 80 regular members, as opposed to the 60 in 1973. Now, through the 80s and 90s, the economic situation in Beacon continued to decline. Frequent changes in leadership and an aging congregation meant downsizing, but the Reformed Church never lost their sense of community. When I spoke with some of the members about their memories of the church, they recalled with a lot of fondness their mum sale every fall, their Christmas celebrations, and their yearly Easter egg hunts. In the summer, there were bonfires and worship held under a big tent, and that was especially when it was too hot to stay inside. And after every service, they gathered in the fellowship hall, not just for coffee, but for sometimes a full Thanksgiving dinner, like a real home-cooked meal. And that's because that's what the Reformed Church was to the faithful. It was their home. And it was a home that each member had a special connection to. I remember one woman told me a story about a hike she took up Mount Beacon, where she went to the top and looked down at the city below, and she saw the sun shining on that steeple of the Reformed Church. And she had never noticed that church before, but the following Sunday she went and she became a member, as she described it, the little church that called to me. And I understand how she feels, because that little church called to me too. In January of 2019, I decided to pay them a visit as a historian and a fan of Withers architecture, just to look around and learn what I could. The congregation was small, a dozen of the nicest people I ever met. They invited me back into the hall for fellowship, and I ended up staying the entire afternoon. I went back almost every week for a year. I was a complete stranger to them, but the welcome they gave me was the warmest I have ever received. Sadly, the Reformed Church of Beacon finally closed in May of 2020. And shortly afterward, I was invited by the pastor, Jan Fritzinger, and some of the church elders to come take a look at the church's archives. What we found was a veritable treasure trove, 207 years of documents, photographs, and records pertaining to the church. And that meant a near priceless, irreplaceable resource for local research, including the names, baptisms, marriages, deaths, and correspondence of church members spanning 2 centuries. Permission was granted by Classis for the Beacon Historical Society to borrow the archives for digitization, and this is why the story of the Reformed Church of Beacon is not over yet. So before we go any further, I'd like to introduce you to my partner in crime during this project. This is Caesar. Caesar is the digital scanner we use to take high-quality photos of every single document. Caesar is operated by a foot pedal, very much like a sewing machine, and that leaves my hands free to turn pages and handle documents. When working with large books, I use these yellow tabs to hold the books flat, and the computer will actually automatically edit those tabs out of the photo. Through this process with the foot pedal and the tabs, Caesar and I can process a 300-page book in about 40 minutes, and that's just by turning the pages and tapping the pedal with my foot for each page. What's especially stellar about this process is that typewritten documents can be converted into PDFs with searchable text. So a researcher can type in a word or a phrase and then find it highlighted wherever it appears in the document, very similar to using Google to answer a question. Even handwritten documents can be saved with tags denoting what sort of information they might contain. And that allows for fast, clean, precise access to information during research. The best thing is that digital files take up no physical space and they never degrade over time, meaning the information offered in these documents will always be available to historians of the future to reference and to explore. And to use a cliche, this is the future of historical preservation. Now, this was our first digitization project, and we've learned so much from the experience. So I'd like to share a list that I've titled 10 Things You Can Do Today to Help Historians Tomorrow. And essentially, these are some observations that I've made during the scanning process that you may find helpful in preparing your own records, personal or otherwise, for traditional and digital preservation. And if you're new to archival research, then these tips will give you an idea of what you might encounter when working with historical documents. So without further ado, here we go. My first tip is stick to the same book for as long as possible. If you haven't already made the leap to keeping your records, committee minutes, calendars, etc. on a digital platform, try to stick to one notebook until it's finished instead of relying on loose leaf paper or multiple notebooks. And if you are working on loose leaf, I definitely recommend organizing them in a binder or a file box in some way, alphabetically, chronologically, as long as they are clearly labeled. The Women's Missionary Society of the Reformed Church during the 1960s were really amazing at keeping their tidy records, and as a result, their documents are some of the ones that are best preserved in the collection. Next tip is to choose type when possible. I know a lot of people are frustrated that we don't teach cursive in schools anymore, but I have to take the side of the new age on that one. Type is a lot easier for historical preservation. Now, not many people handwrite things anymore anyway, but it's worth mentioning that even when you're printing typed documents, make sure you leave a margin on the sides. Not only does that leave room for things like holding them flat when scanning, but it also allows researchers to handle the paper with more security without damaging the sections of the document that have the information. And if you are still a holdout on handwriting, then please at least consider using pen instead of pencil, because pencil does fade very severely over time. Now, this is a big one. Avoid metal if possible. Spiral notebooks, paper clips, and binder clips, they all will rust over time, and that not only leaves marks, but it can make separating documents very difficult. And it will result in damage, especially for more fragile pieces like newspaper. Staples are usually okay, so long as the pages are stapled in such a way that all the parts of the document can be isolated and laid flat for scanning. Now, on a similar note, when you're attaching papers together, remember that Scotch tape yellows and flakes. It's very useful in the moment for keeping things together, but the tape will disintegrate over time and it will get very messy and will usually leave damage on the document that you attached it to. Similarly messy is newspaper, which also yellows and flakes over time. Now, newspapers are one of our most treasured research tools, but they're also one of our messiest resources. They crumble, they tear, and if you close them between the pages of a book, like in this image, then they will leave shadows behind as they degrade. I personally don't mind the newspaper shadows because they're harmless. I think they look kind of cool. And newspapers pressed in books are usually better preserved than others. But if you're an exceptionally tidy person and this is the sort of thing that's going to bother you, then you may want to explore other possibilities for storing your newspaper clippings. But whatever you do with your clippings, whatever you do, please do not attach smaller pieces of paper to large ones this way. Top photo, some of that information is obscured, necessitated me flipping over that little piece of paper and making a really weird sized photo to get all of that information. If you are preparing documents for record keeping, whether that's for digitization or otherwise, and you have smaller pieces of paper that need to stay attached, either staple them or, my recommendation, use like an archival glue stick and glue them flat to a larger piece of paper. Makes them much, much, much easier to manage. Now, this is a very important one. Label everything. I am incredibly serious about this, and I cannot get more serious about this. Label everything. Put a date on everything. It can be really difficult for historians to place your document in a greater context without knowing where on the timeline it belongs. And probably more important, please label the backs of your photographs. Put the names on there, even if you don't know their whole name, even a first name is helpful, better than nothing. You remember who the person in this photo is now, but chances of your children remembering are very slim, and chances of your grandchildren knowing are next to none, and chances are of historians 100 years later knowing a nameless person in a photo. It can make things very, very difficult. So please label the backs of your photos, because an identified photo is a piece of that person that gets preserved forever. My example here is we have the name of Dr. McCullum, who was one of the Reformed Church's pastors, and then here is his photograph. When it comes to photos themselves, try to avoid glossy finishes. I think of a lot of the photos that came out of the 80s and 90s with that high gloss finish on them. In order to take really high quality scans of images and documents, the scanner uses very bright lights to illuminate the scan desk, and glossy finishes on photos means extra finagling to take a picture with no glare. For this reason, I actually prefer the old cabinet photos of the turn of the century, and that's like what Dr. McCullum's was, where it's got a matte finish on the front of the image. Now, this is more of a warning to those who are interested in working with 100-year-old documents, and that is there will be bugs. Bugs happen. This is just a natural consequence of things being stored in basements and attics and closets. Bugs will not hurt you. What can be dangerous is mold. If you have a document that's been damaged by mold, make sure you isolate it from the others so that way the mold doesn't spread. Luckily, documents that have been exposed to mold can be cured if you put them out in some fresh air and sun for a few hours, and that will eventually kill the mold. Now, the most important thing is to remember that absolutely everything you do is a part of history. Now, the best way I can illustrate this last point to you is through some of the human moments, the funny, the sad, or the just plain weird things that I found combing through the fairly humdrum scores of committee minutes and baptismal records. Now, most of these came to me by way of a man who I've come to consider my friend, a clerk named Frank L. Hedges, who was a house painter by day and a prolific letter writer by night. Hedges also kept copies of every letter he wrote from the 1920s to the 1960s, organized alphabetically in a big Van Tyne file box. He was the one who wrote so many of those letters looking for a permanent pastor for the church during that period, but he also kept correspondence with local businesses, with other churches, with various organizations, and on one occasion with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hedges also had a particularly blunt way of writing that made me laugh on more than one occasion. For example, here he tells a contractor hired to repair the church to do the job before the wasps get active, as the top of the spire is full of them. And here he writes to a visiting pastor asking for clarification of a rumor concerning the church being for sale, which, according to Hedges, it was and is not. Now, still another example was from yet another visiting pastor who was cautioned that if he planned to take the ferry, to not consider it because they're tied up for the first time in over 800 years by a longshoreman strike. And it's worth noting that the ferry did not then, and nor has it yet, celebrated an 800th birthday. These small moments are essentially footnotes to the more conventional history that they're embedded in. And they're worth far more than just names and dates because they offer a window into who the people of the church actually were. Furthermore, these are the pieces of history that are often lost outside of a large-scale digitization effort, as they'll usually be discarded to save space for more official or informational documents. But in my opinion, these are the pieces that are most worth preserving, because how else would we remember Mrs. McElrath, whose letter asks that the church accept a donation of 60 cents, this being the final pocket change of her little boy Alexander, who gave it to her 2 days before his unexpected death. How about H. Mortimer Brockway of the family that ran Brockway Brickyards? He was an IBM manager and school board president, but how else would we know that he liked to draw on his handouts when he was in meetings, or that his favorite doodle was his signature? Here's a letter from the Star of Bethlehem Baptist Church attempting to offer, in a very feeble way, the deepest thanks from the hearts of their entire membership for a chicken dinner that was hosted at the Reformed Church. And honestly, if the food was that good, why shouldn't we remember it? Isn't it worth remembering Mrs. George Menny, who wrote the script for a play called The Preacher's Been Here, with a note to Mrs. Reed to ask her, please be grandma? And why should history forget young Eleanor Avis, who responded to this prompt on her Sunday school assignment with, do I really know myself, and what am I, and who am I? I should try harder to get acquainted with myself. These are the pieces that make history stop being just a box of dusty, decaying paper and start being something alive. The only thing between us and the people who wrote these documents is time, and when these moments are preserved, even that vanishes. Now, before we close, I want to share one of my favorite moments with you. It was a cold January night, and I was at the Historical Society late working on the documents. And in a box of unsorted papers, I found this: the original handwritten specifications for the construction of the church, including sketches of architectural details dated 1859 and signed by the hand of the architect himself, Frederick Withers. Somehow, against all odds, these 16 pages survived 162 years of hardship to arrive, nearly perfect and tied with a ribbon. And I was in awe of the people before me who'd watched over and protected it for nearly 2 centuries, and of the people before me who had cared for and cherished the stories of this church and who worked to make sure that not a moment was forgotten. Digital preservation attempts to honor that commitment. The record keepers are gone, and someday the last papers will yellow and fall apart, but the digital documents will continue eternally. and with them, the church and the love of her people. And maybe that's a more philosophical view of the archival process than is strictly necessary, but considering the source material, I find it poetic. So I'd like to end with a word of thanks to the archivists, to Ben Hammond and Mrs. Verplank from 1913, to city historian E.R. Corwin from 1938, to Frank L. Hedges, who kept every letter he ever wrote, to Jim Munger, who stored so much of this collection in his house until his death, and to the historians a century from now who will inherit this digital archive from us. I want to tell you, thank you for taking such good care of these stories. And to my friends from the Reformed Church, I never met Reverend Owen Mercer, who was your pastor years ago, but I hope it's all right if I quote him now. Everyone we meet is a patch and a quill that makes up the pattern of our lives. And I am so grateful to have met you, and I hope that through this project we've been able to honor your devotion to your church and your enduring faith, because the patch that you made in the pattern of our city's history endures yet. So thank you. And that is the end for now, but I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight to hear about the history of the church and the Beacon Historical Society's digitization efforts. And with Diane's permission, I'd like to open the floor for any questions regarding digital preservation and this project.
So thank you guys so much for watching that a second time. I think many of you were here with us when we did that presentation last spring. But we are still here for questions concerning the archival process or the history of the Dutch Reformed Church. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to wave a hand.
Grandpa's got a question.
All right.
I noticed I didn't see any teleprompters or anything. You must have had notes of sorts, or you just kept it all up here.
I did have notes. I'm very glad that no one noticed the computer cursor that stayed in the middle of the screen for about half the presentation, or if you did, thank you for not saying anything about it. I actually had the slideshow up on my computer doing screen share, and then what you couldn't see as the viewer was another window open that had my script for the presentation. So I don't mean to shatter the illusion, I did not have that entire thing memorized. I was reading off of a teleprompter, but it was another window that was open that was not being shared with the audience, and that cursor that was in the middle of the screen was at one point I went to enlarge my script window, and somehow the cursor ended up being visible on the screen share. So
it was beautiful.
Thank you. But yes, so I was reading off of a teleprompter that was, for the most part, scripted. I'm thinking there was a couple of occasions where I thought of one more thing that I wanted to throw in there and then did. And then the original Q&A was not scripted. This is not scripted, in case you're going to be looking around for the teleprompter. So I didn't find any architectural prints. That was one of the things that was like on my holy grail list of things that I hope to find. I had really been hoping to find blueprints. Unfortunately, the Withers document was the best we found as far as actual architectural stuff goes. We did find some receipts for work that had been done in the church over the years. So, a receipt to this person for some new brick that had to be brought in, a receipt to this person for pews being replaced, that sort of thing. But as far as actual blueprints goes, just a couple of little sketches that were in the Withers document were the best for that. Not even close. At the time of doing this presentation, I had optimistically said that we were maybe 80% through, and that is not the case. The move to our new location also has prolonged the process, so that held us back a little bit, but since going through the material again after the move, I came to realize exactly how much more material there was yet for us to get through. My original estimation of how many documents we had in the collection were well over 1,000. Frank Hedges' letters themselves constituted at least 500 or more documents. But we've got two big Rubbermaid containers, like 15-gallon containers, that are just of loose documents, completely unorganized. So that itself is going to take me several months to get through. So it may be a while yet.
Emily, I think you told me when you started this that the original material, the whole collection that you did, is ultimately going back to the head
Oh, no, go ahead.
But do you have their permission to mount some of it in an online archive that can be accessed?
That's what we're hoping. So, and I just realized I promised Peter that I was going to repeat the questions before I answered them, and I forgot I was doing that. So Mary just asked, do the documents go back to the governing body of the church when we're done with them, and are we going to be able to keep some of them for display at the museum? So the documents themselves, the hard copies, do belong to CLASIS, the governing body of the Reformed Churches of America. They have the Theological Seminary in New Brunswick, which is the oldest in the country, if I'm remembering it correctly. And when we are done with the documents, they will all be going to their archives in New Brunswick. This whole arrangement that we have with CLASIS is not something that's typically done. This was something that was arranged by the request of the church elders of the Beacon Church when they were closing. They felt that the documents needed to stay in Beacon in some capacity for the research purposes of Beaconites. So we set up an arrangement with CLASIS that we would be allowed to hold onto the hard copies of the documents until we were done digitally preserving them, on which time we would turn the hard copies back over to them. I've since spoken to the CLASIS archivist, Matt Massaro, and we have kind of a tentative agreement that I'm keeping a list of things that we would like to possibly keep on a permanent loan, to have on display, to have for research purposes, hands-on at our archives. And that's something that we're going to work out closer to the end of the project. But we do have a kind of a running list of things that we think that we might probably like to keep. The Withers document being one of them, just because that's such a very Hudson Valley thing that it may not mean very much to New Brunswick, but it means an awful lot to us. So.
Do you also know that the church in Newburgh is a Withers church, the one that has the fire in its community hall in the back, not touching the church itself, but smoking it. And it's undergoing a massive restoration. And so Calvary Presbyterian was Withers of the same era, 1856-7. A lot of similar architectural, Gothic, English kind of features inside. And so you should keep your eye on Calvary Presbyterian in Newark. That wasn't its original name. That's the name it has now that several churches merged. But, the old first Presbyterian that Withers built across the river is coming back to life.
It's really wonderful to hear
You
about.
will probably want to tell your friends from the Reformed Beacon Church that they can come touch and visit another.
Do you want to say that to the microphone so the audience can hear it? Our live stream audience?
Yeah. In Newburgh, Frederick Withers built the first Presbyterian church on the corner of South and Grand Street. It's next to our old city cemetery, the Old Town Cemetery. And it is being restored by a lot of insurance money because it had a fire in its community building, which is the building behind the church, a 1950s, not an 1850s, add-on. And so the church has been cleaned and restored. They're fixing the bell tower, etc., which also was problematic, by the way. So Withers wasn't the best at building bell towers where the bell wouldn't fall out. So our Newburgh bell tower also has some loose stone. But the church is undergoing restoration. You can see cranes and everything all around it the last year. It will be revealed again probably by the end of this year, and it's something for Beacon to come and visit because it's a companion church. It's another Withers Gothic built at the same time as this.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So if we have any fans of Withers architecture in the audience, go see that. And really enjoy these churches while we still have them, because this is not the first church to be in jeopardy in the Hudson Valley. I know the Highland Current just recently did a great series of articles about Hudson Valley churches that were in jeopardy just from the last couple of years of world events. And Withers, especially as a Hudson Valley architect, his churches here are some of our treasures. So if you know of one that you can still attend, or you can go see at least from the street level, do it. But works to wait. Lenny?
Is there a digital backup process that the Historical Society has? Like the work that you're doing is also somewhere else?
So the question is, do we have a digital backup? And I really wish that our tech guy was here to answer that question for you. We currently have the documents on a laptop that's hooked up to the scanner. When I'm done doing the project, we will be able to move those documents into our full digital archival system that we're still continuously building and adding to at the Historical Society. As of right now, I haven't integrated the Dutch church documents into our full archive just because it's been easier for me to keep track of an itemized list of things that I've scanned for classes. So, do we have a backup, Diane?
Thank you for asking the question about the digital backup. So our whole Historical Society, all our records are on the cloud. So everything that we do enter has all these different resource systems. There's a digital resource, there's a personnel, like members, etc. And then all of our photos and all our records are on the cloud. So the question about this particular project, it is on a laptop that needs to be moved to the cloud. So that should be the next step. You mentioned about the bricks that Mr. Kitteridge purchased. So Kitteridge built the Riverview Sanatorium, and it would be interesting to research when that was built, and if it was the same time period, and maybe use those bricks.
It'd be really cool if he did use the church bricks to build his sanatorium. The building that Dr. Kittredge had his sanatorium in, unfortunately, does not exist anymore. That was one of the buildings that we lost to urban renewal. So if he did build his sanatorium out of the bricks, then that means that we lost the bricks too. But any more questions? All right. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, somebody named Barbara who said, "Good job, Emily," on the live stream.
Thank you, Barbara. You're very nice. Do we have any questions for Mr. Gavin Heckert, who is the current owner of the church property? Because he is here with us tonight and willing to take questions about the work that he's done on the church, things that he's learned about the property, research that he's done, his plans for the property.
Thanks, Emily. That was a great presentation. The one thing I did not want to hear was that Frederick Withers was not so good at building bell towers. But, this one looks good still. We were told by the inspector that it's in pretty good shape. So. The church is in really great shape, actually, considering how old it is and the amount of funding that's been available to it. So, and the one thing that hasn't been taken care of, the cemetery, is something that we're actually working to restore. And I've been working with Emily on getting documentation for the cemetery and trying to figure out exactly how to proceed with that. So and Emily's been very helpful with that process as well. Our plans for the church, and with the blessing of the Reformed Church of Beacon, as well as to turn this into an intimate space for performance and arts, and turn the parsonage next door into a hotel, actually. So we're expanding the parsonage and then turning the church into a performance space with a stage. But I'm here to answer your questions.
Is there any work actually going on inside the church now?
Currently, we have not begun work yet. We're still in the planning board process. We probably will be for a bit longer.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
That maybe with the Beacon Historical Society, that somehow there is a presentation of something inside the church, so that people can see what the church looks like before they go to the meeting. Because I don't think a lot of people in Beacon have actually been inside the church.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, if the Historical Society wanted to organize a day to come toward the church, I'd be more than happy to host that. So that's a good idea. Yeah. And then we can also talk more about our plans at that point too. So that's a good idea. What's that? Q56. Why is that? Okay. I'll remember that.
We could do a cross-river tour. We could all come see Withers East and Withers West. I propose it's called the back door tour.
Backboard tours?
Where you do anything.
Okay,
They have those kind of things that they do.
sounds good. I'm there.
Yeah, can you tell us about the organ and the proposal of what's going to happen with the organ?
Yes, I can. So right now, the organ is a problem. And I'm trying to work out exactly what we need to do to take care of it. That currently, our plan is to move the organ. I've spoken with a nonprofit organ preservationist who is trying to help me out with relocating the organ. He actually told me it's not the greatest organ and that there's about 400 organs in the United States that are in search of homes. So I'm looking desperately for a good solution to this organ. We unfortunately cannot keep it. It needs, in order to make it into performance shape as it was once, it would cost between $100,000 and $200,000 as it is to keep it in place and repair it. Unfortunately, there's nobody that I've heard that wants to actually use it and keep it in place for the purpose of what it was created for. So it's kind of a sad story, but that's where we are right now with the organ. Yeah, Emily.
So you've been working on the church for a while now, and I know everyone who works on old buildings ends up with a couple of good restoration stories. Do you have any adventures in restoration or, just hoping for some of the dusty corners of the church that you want to share?
Well, yeah, we did take out a couple pews already. I hope not number 56. But the other, it's just me that's working on the church right now. I've fixed doors, I go there and take out the garbage and I clean. I removed 2 pews, and underneath the pews, this was just a couple weeks ago, I found one of those, an old undated quarter, and I'm not sure what the undated quarter's date is because it's undated, but I was looking into it, I think they're around 1925. And then I found a buffalo nickel, which was also around the same year. Things like that come up every now and then, but I was also talking to Emily about a couple of spaces that she's never seen before, and if you didn't know, the room behind the altar is 1 story, but it used to be 2 stories, and they actually they took out the floor of the 2nd story and lifted the ceiling. And there's no way to access that space through any normal means. In order to access that space, you have to go to the choir balcony, climb the ladder through a small square hole in the ceiling, and then walk across that whole ceiling, which is another space that was yet unexplored, that you can't really get to unless you have a tall ladder. And then you have to go through an opening in the brick in order to get into this other space that is above that room in the back. And then you can actually see that, oh yeah, this actually was, there's half windows in that story. You can see it from outside, but inside you would never know. So we had, even when we had made the purchase of the church, we had no idea that this space existed. So that's something that Emily didn't even know about. But I have not found any more boxes of records anywhere. If I do, I will tell Emily. Yeah?
Are you planning to remove the pews?
We want to keep the pews, but our current plan is to repurpose the pews and create we're keeping the finishing, the plaster, all the stained glass windows, everything you see is how it's going to look, but the pews are going to be raked up to the balcony area. So our current plan is to actually repurpose the pews and place them back up. And so if you can imagine, half the floor space will be as it is, and then the pews will rake up stadium style, I guess is what you call it, to the balcony. But we will have pews available, actually, because there will be some extras. If anybody's interested in some pews. Number 56? Okay.
We have number 22 from the
It is.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
All right.
It certainly is.
How does that impact your renovation?
It doesn't impact the renovations at all. I mean, being in the historic district in Beacon is pretty much what impacts what the exterior is going to look like, and so nothing on the exterior is going to be changed all that much. We're putting one new doorway in the back, but it being on the National Historic Register, I believe doesn't have any real implications for renovation, for anything we're doing anyway. Yeah?
I had a couple of questions about the cemetery.
Mhm.
First is sort of, what kind of, if any, sort of regulations, laws, local, state, whatever, that govern historic cemetery like that, and sort of what are you contending with? And then the second part would be sort of what are your initial thoughts about how to efficiently use this space, the cemetery itself?
Can you repeat that question?
Well, I think I don't know if I can word for word, but the question is with regard to how we go about finding out the implications of actually restoring the cemetery and what our plans are to do that. And the second part of your question was?
What are your initial thoughts about how to use that space?
The cemetery space. So I'll start from that. We want to restore the cemetery to the way it looked before it was began to be neglected. According to everything we know, it's been about 100 years. Our plan was to do that, and the only thing we want to create that's new, well, actually there's an existing trail, but we wanted to create that trail so that there's a walkable path from Beekman Street up into our property. And those are our only real plans, and as well as much as we can open the cemetery up to the public, and have everybody be able to enjoy the cemetery as a peaceful place, as a memorial to the people that were buried there. The process of doing that, I am not familiar with at all, but our starting point is with the State Preservation Society, and this is what we're working with on Emily to get them documentation and get their input as to what they think that we need to do to proceed. I've also been talking to people who restore tombstones, and I want to kind of get an idea of what it would take to actually make the cemetery really pristine the way it was. I'm not sure what's involved, but the first steps are to kind of assess the situation and bring in a professional, which I'm definitely not a professional, but with our plan, it calls for at least in the beginnings, uprating all the tombs, because there are a bunch of tombs that have been knocked over and vandalized. There are also 3 or 4 crypts, and I would think that we would have to seal the crypts, because some of them are open at this point, and make sure that they're secure so nobody will go into them. And that just involves like regular masonry work, because they're pretty much just brick that go into the ground. But honestly, we have not begun to scratch the surface of what actually needs to be accomplished here, but our plan is to restore it and build the trail. And if that answers your question, I think that's all the information I have on that. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the conventional hotel?
Mm-hmm.
What size?
Oh, so yeah, so the hotel is going to be a boutique hotel that is an expansion of the Parsonage House. If you're familiar with that house, there hasn't been anybody that's been occupying that house for several years that I know of. Emily, do you know when the last time?
I might be wrong, but the last family I can remember being there was the Ortlists back in the 70s, around the time of the whole youth thing. And I think that was the last time they had a pastor and his family lived there full-time for a long period of time. There may have been a couple spots here and there or something occupied for a short period of time, but that was the last long-term occupancy.
Wasn't it youth there at one time?
It may have been, but not when there were people living there.
No, not living there.
Yeah, so the house currently is in shambles, but we're going to bring some life back to the house and expand upon it to create a 30-room hotel. There'll be small rooms. The idea behind the hotel is, so I've worked in nonprofit theater and throughout my life I started a performance venue in Philadelphia and then worked for Performance Space 122 in New York City. And I'm used to working with these nonprofit organizations in order to bring performance to this beautiful spaces such as this church. Part of what the hotel will be doing for us is it will act as a funder such to provide us with the ability to actually have these performances, and we're creating a campus that the hotel will interact with the performance space in order to we'll host organizers and artists over there, as well as guests and tourists to Beacon. But the idea is that they have a symbiotic relationship between this hotel and the performance space. So instead of really having a grant funding that space, we'll have more of like the hotel helping to fund the space. So it's very helpful. I don't think without the hotel we'd be able to necessarily do what we want to do with the church, and of course at like a lower production cost for everybody. So we want to be able to have that space available to the community as well as tourists that come up. And part of that is the hotel really enables us to be able to do that. And yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Do you know how old that house is, and are there any architectural features left?
The house is not, it's pretty bland. I hear it's a kind of a Frankenstein, so I can't remember specific dates. It was part of another property, then it was donated to the church property, and then there were a couple different additions throughout the ages, and the architectural features of that house aren't too significant. It's under, when you go to the National Historic Registrar, what do you call it, site and look up this church, it says, it tells you that this parsonage house was not a contributing feature of the historical elements of the property. It lists the church and the cemetery, and it goes ahead and says the house has nothing important, but it is special to Beacon, and one of the reasons why we're restoring the house and building onto it. Inside it's kind of, there's nothing really great about the inside. I would take anybody in there. Also, it's not in good shape, and I wouldn't open that up to like the tour of the church. But if anybody was interested in seeing that, I'd be willing to go in there with somebody. But it's not nice.
Have you been able to establish any kind of timeline for progression on all of this and when it might be done?
Yeah, so right now it depends on how long we're in planning board mode with the city. If we get approvals, and once we get approvals, we could probably look to starting some form of construction on the site anyway after this winter. And then it would be about a year from then until we have anything significant for completed with the hotel. So what we're talking about is by 2025, we should be able to have everything in place. If things go quickly, probably by sometime in the end of 2024, but that's pretty quick. Somebody over here have a question? Yeah, Tuesday night, I mean, the city moves at a very slow pace, and we have to wait a month in order to meeting, and then we go month to month. And with our project, since it's a very large project, and there's a lot of people that are concerned and want to have their voices heard, it makes the process a little bit longer and more drawn out. So that's how it goes.
I don't know who would be able to answer, Emily or Mary, who's the new borough historian, or Gavin. The ceiling, if I recall, is leather.
It's canvas, yeah.
Oh,
It's canvas. It's canvas actually.
It does look like.
It's got a shine to it.
Lynn Crusta
Oh,
is the name of a material very popular a century and more ago. That's sawdust and linseed oil pressed to imitate leather. So you think of it as linoleum or something like that today. But Lynn Crusta is deliberately made to imitate a leather surface.
would you mind giving me a microphone so you have it? Mary, if you don't mind repeating that?
What you're looking at when you say you look up and you see, what did you call it? It was made out of what?
Canvas.
Canvas. It could be canvas.
That's what the.
And oilcloth, of course, is a canvas coated. But in the days of oilcloth and other coated canvases, one particularly popular surface for walls and ceilings was called Lincrusta, Lincrusta. It's linseed oil and sawdust mixed and pressed so that it kind of, when you look at it, it's sawdust, so it looks like wood paneling or looks like leather in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and further with that, so one of our the other owners is the director at Women's Workshop Studios, and she does a lot of work in print. And she was saying how those ceilings on the canvas are, we think they're hand printed, not hand painted, but there's a print, and we're going to try to replicate that, and because some of it's damaged, and we want to put it back the way it was and restore those panels as well. So we think that we can sort of recreate that and make that look new again. But that's one of the features that we love about that place. The wood arches and the ceiling and the canvas, it looks great as it is. Yeah.
What made you take away from the church for what you
Oh, well, as I said, I've been involved in the performance arts for most of my life, and when my family moved to Beacon, well, I should start before that. Since I started the first performance space in Philadelphia and left that, I've been waiting to settle down somewhere in order to start another space. And since when we settled down in Beacon, we knew that we were going to be here for life, and this was the place to do it. And I've always loved having performance in old churches or old historic buildings. In fact, one of the reasons that drew me to this church is because when I worked with PS 122 in the city, it was during a time when, if you don't know about this space, it's in a high school in the East Village, and it was sort of taken over by artists in the 80s. That's where they filmed Fame. And in 2011, the city provided Performance Space 122 the opportunity to completely restore, renovate that building, and create a state-of-the-art theater space. But during a 5-year period, we had to do all of our shows in different spaces all over the city. And my favorite shows that we put on happened to be in church spaces that were located all over pretty much Manhattan and Brooklyn. And we used probably 10 different spaces that were just like this. It was always like a challenge they sounded great, but it was a challenge to fine tune them. But the end product was something that was even more special than being in a theater specifically built to be a theater space. Like, these churches were my favorite places to put on shows. So that drew me to like looking around at churches, and this one became available. It was, during basically the start of COVID, and And through my kids, we knew another one of our current partners, and she was more involved on the real estate end. And I came to her and asked her if she thought this was possible to do. And you know, we just talked about this other day. She was the one that kind of propelled us to sort of make this dream come true. But I've been thinking about this for 20 years at this point, and it just happened to work out this way.
Is there anyone online here with questions or comments?
Nope, all good.
Well, thank you so much, Gavin, for answering the questions. And Emily, for the complex process in which you created this philosophical, artistic, historic program, to tell the story of the church and the love that you have for the members of the church. Sadly that it closed, but so we really appreciate all the work that you've done. And I know from touching those documents, or she was talking about those 15-gallon tubs of loose documents. It's like every piece of paper you pick up is just filled with history and interrelationships within the community, the banking industry, the local people, the local businesses, the ladies' organization. Oh my God.
Yes, please talk about the ladies' organization.
Well, not specifically about the ladies' organization, but just to kind of underline what Diane's saying, she's not exaggerating. Every piece of paper that you have in your house right now is potentially a historic resource or an artifact. If we think of just a letter, think of the last piece of mail you got, even if it was junk mail, that's got your name with your home address on it. It's got the name of the company that was trying to contact you. It's got their current address, their location. It's got their current logo on it. It's got the information that they're trying to sell you. Even your junk mail, if it manages to survive another 100 years, could end up being a historic artifact. So think how much more important your letters, your photo albums, your certificates, your newspaper articles, these are all things that are going to serve us very well if they survive the next 100 years. And
Can
if
you
they
go ahead and just bring that to the
please don't bring us anything prior to like 1975. We've had people try to bring us things that are like very, very, very recent history, and unfortunately it's not history yet. It's got to have some age on it before it becomes history, but hold on to it. Oh, well, yeah, COVID stuff is definitely history, but something that was on the front page of the Free Press yesterday about a new lawn mowing ordinance, that's not going to be history for another 70 years.
Just mention the ladies auxiliary or Christian women's organization that.
Yeah, the Women's Missionary Society of the Reformed Church, they were spectacular in their fundraising efforts, in their community outreach. They even did some fundraising and outreach to women's organizations in other countries that were connected with the Reformed Church, and their claim to fame, at least as far as my archival project goes, is their records were pristine. They had everything neatly organized, alphabetized, dated. A lot of things were very neatly typewritten, nice wide margins on their pages. They filled up all of their notebooks from cover to cover, so everything was very, very organized, and as a result, we have the most information about their activities during their highest period of activity at the church, because they were so well organized.
In doing the research with the Beacon Hebrew Alliance, the Ladies Auxiliary, well, it wasn't called that, it was called the Beacon Women's Hebrew Aid Society. Their records were also impeccable, and they really showed, and thanks to their records is really how we were able to tell the story of the 100 years of the synagogue. So I would thank the ladies for doing their work.
I'm sure a little bit about doing the Beacon Hebrew Alliance, about trying to find those records. Where were all those records?
They were
years of BHA.
Well, unfortunately, there were floods in the 60s. There was a flood in the basement in the 1960s, so a lot of their records were damaged and, thrown away. And then over the years, they had so many different rabbis year after year. Like you were talking about the clergy where they were paid very little. Same with coming to Beacon, the rabbis would be here for less than a year or 2 years at the most. And they would clean house, so there weren't very many records, but the ladies kept the records. And then the women would bring them to their homes, and that's where they were stored for many years. So most of the records that we have came from somebody's home. They brought in boxes filled with mostly the ladies' records. Unfortunately, the first year's minutes from 1922 is when the synagogue first started. So that we really had to piece together the story through newspaper clippings, and then most of the ladies did the work.
And then with the Reformed Church, we were very lucky that one of the members of the church, Jim Munger, somehow the majority of the documents ended up in his house. I never got to meet Jim. He passed away before I was involved with the church by many, many years. But according to the church elders, somehow all of the church's archival records ended up in his house. And then when he passed, his family didn't want it and didn't know what to do with it, and were actually very close to disposing of it, and instead dumped it off at the church and said, you guys figure it out. And they did by putting their boxes in all the nooks and crannies that you could possibly find in that building. I mean, we were opening up closets and thinking that we were done pulling everything out of the closets, and then realizing this wall is not a wall, it's cardboard boxes. And when we start dismantling that wall, it's all boxes of records. So it's really surprising where you can end up finding history squirreled away in individual people's homes before it ever reaches an institutional level like us.
Any other questions? Thank you again.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Gavin. And for having signed in, please sign in at the door. I think you're all members here, so that's good to go. Well, have a good night, and we'll see you hopefully June 6th for our next program, which will be at the Beacon High School Theater at 7 o'clock.